Hello. This is intended to be vulnerability post number 7, which was part of my vulnerability post challenge that actually was supposed to be a 7-day challenge that was started maybe 3 weeks ago. And I'm just now getting around to post number 7. Aside from life blowing up and an out of country trip for almost a week being in the mix, the main thing that was holding me back until now from posting this is that I knew it was going to be a video. And I knew it was going to be a video of me sharing my personal story, my personal background, how I became who I am today, why I am the way I am today. You guys hear me talk a lot about emotional healing and personal development, and that's because as a result of everything I've been through, I've navigated my own journey through healing and spirituality, and now I am starting to coach other people through their own relationships and their own personal development, personal growth, and achieve their own healing. So I want to, before I start talking about my own personal background, I just want to say that, a big part of my journey through healing involves, telling my story about what I grew up around, my environment growing up. And so, of course, that involves talking about my family. And I'm sure there might be some people out there watching this who know my family or are even in my family. And you might hear some details of this and they might be surprising because maybe you never didn't know that was happening. Or maybe you do. And it seems like I'm just sitting here talking shit about like villainizing somebody else. And I just want to say that is not the point of this video. So I have no interest in bringing shame or anything like that, to throwing anybody under the bus at this point. My sole purpose in sharing my story is to just do exactly what I called this, my vulnerability video, making myself vulnerable so that people out there can know that I'm not just someone who like randomly one day decided like, oh, coaching sounds fun. I've done this shit. I've done the work. I've been through it myself. I've overcome some pretty shitty emotional obstacles to get where I am today. And I know from experience, I've been there. So that is why I'm sharing my story, so that everybody out there knows, like, hey, I can relate to a lot of shit that you're probably going through too, because I've done it, I've been there. Just making myself more relatable for people. But, okay, so now that that's aside, I felt really misunderstood as a kid. On one hand, I was very empathetic and compassionate. I had a heart for people. I always wanted to help, especially if it was people who were suffering. And I even got really involved in church youth group, and I went on I think 3 different third world country mission trips where we, helped build churches and went to feeding centers, and, of course, and some of that involved ministering to people. But in any case, I had a big heart for helping other people. And I remember even thinking before I chose interior design that I was going to go into psychology as a major in college, but I thought about being a counselor. So, So I had that on one hand, and then on the other hand, I had this, I was pretty damn sassy, as I like to put it. I know that's a shock to everybody, but you just believe me, it's true. And the way that manifested itself outwardly is that I had a big problem with authority, particularly toward my parents, my mom and my stepdad, and probably even my dad a little bit, but it also extended to teachers and other authority figures, or somebody who was maybe babysitting me or in charge of me for a little while. I just didn't like being told what to do. And I didn't, if someone tried to tell me what I had to do, I needed to know why I needed to do it. And I would I would object and argue. So I had a lot of anger festering inside, and it was particularly toward those who tried to tell me what to do and made me feel like I wasn't in control. And the reason I had an issue with not feeling in control is because I grew up in an environment that was enveloped by a lot of emotional chaos. Basically, by the time I was around 4, my mom had already been divorced and remarried a man that I think she dated maybe for a year or something. And he became my stepdad. They got married. And unfortunately, my stepdad was someone who was an alcoholic who struggled with it as long as I had known him. And also, he had a lot of his own emotional issues that were unresolved. And the way that manifested itself was that he tended to use uh, physical intimidation and emotional abuse as a means of asserting his dominance and control and maintaining control in the family. So basically, on the other side of that, my mom, who I loved, but I didn't respect, unfortunately, when I was a kid, she was well intentioned, but her relationship with my stepdad was built largely on fear, control, codependency. And so when you have someone who doesn't want to be controlled and you have someone who wants to control and is codependent, that creates a lot of clashing. And so my parents would have these hellacious fights where there was screaming, there was name calling, there was cussing, and a lot of times it got downright scary in our house when they would fight. And I mean, so I was observing this chaos and reacting to it. I saw my stepdad when I was a kid. I saw him as the transgressor. I saw him as the reason, the stimulus for all this shit that was going on in the house, because he was so angry and would project and spew all that onto everybody else. And I hated him for it. I hated the way he talked to my mother. I hated the way he treated her. And I didn't learn until later in life that I actually was angry toward my mom too, because, like, she was the parent, she was my mom, and she, I looked to her to defend me and to protect us. And, she chose to marry somebody who, now we were subject to this chaotic environment where there was always a lot of anger and arguing and whatever, and nobody was doing anything about it. So that's, like this anger that I held inside manifested through talking back and, like being a smartass and all this kind of stuff. So, my parents unfortunately looked at me though as if I was I was a problem child. They was constantly told how bad I was and how bad my attitude was. And instead of really, like, I think, examining the underlying reasons of why my behavior was this way, it was just like, oh, we need to treat her. So I was sent, I don't even know that my parents really went to counseling themselves, but I know I was sent to counseling, and they also switched me into a private school thinking that, like, going to a Christian school will help straighten me out. So these things were like symptomatic of like them trying to fix my behavior. So I didn't think of it this way at the time, but like what that really communicated to me was that, showing your emotion, showing anger is not okay, and who you are is not okay. You need to change yourself to be someone we like better, and, blah, blah, blah. Well, and so I think I'm getting a little too into the weeds here, but basically my problem was that it seemed like the focus was centered largely on correcting my personality or my behavior rather than actually addressing the true source of the dysfunction in the household, and that was my parents' relationships to each other and what exactly were they modeling. And so, I would mouth off, and my stepdad wasn't someone, he had a zero tolerance policy. So for me, like, and it wasn't even just if I talked back to him, it was like my mom, he didn't stand for that. So he would run to her defense. And there were many times where if I pissed him off bad enough, he got in my face, yelling in my face. I was a little girl, and this man is like towering over me, his nose touching mine, and like yelling at me with spit flying onto my face. I just have very vivid memories of this. And it was scary. I was terrified of him. So I acted a lot differently around him than I did my mom. And I think the reason why I disrespected my mom so much is because I didn't see her respecting herself and her own relationship. So I was merely like modeling the behaviors that I was seeing around me, and then I was blamed for my shitty behavior. And I was a child, again. Like, if I was an adult, different story, but I was a child. So I was really a reflection of my environment. But anyway, so I, there was parts of my childhood that were more chaotic than others, but I think it got really pretty tumultuous. Like, it was really, I remember it being especially more volatile when I was younger. And I think there were periods of time where my stepdad was like really trying to work on his shit, and he maybe was trying to give up the alcohol or go through AA or whatever. And unfortunately, I don't think he ever really got terribly far in that process anytime he attempted to do it. But let's just say that there were some periods of more peaceful environment than others in my childhood. But there was one period in particular when I was around 15 there was a lot of stuff going on in my life as a teenager. Like I was starting a new school, I was learning to drive. And the biggest thing was that there was a lot of stuff going on with our family business at the time and just in general, and emotionally in the family too. And my mom went off. She was taking thyroid medications for the better part of her life. She went off her medications and it totally messed with her hormonal balance. So she started just having these like unexplained meltdowns of like random stuff. And it was pretty tumultuous at the time because there was just like, she would just blow up for no reason, or at least, for me, it was like no reason. And like I asked her to go to the mall with my friend one day and she started just like bawling and crying because she said no and I wouldn't take no for an answer. And so she just like ran outside and went into a meltdown because she couldn't take the stress. And I was just kind of like, dude, what just happened? So basically the doctor said, well, you should not be around stressful stimuli for a while and while you get leveled out. So she went to go live with my grandparents, her parents, for like, I think a month or two. So and my brother at the time had already gone off to college. So he wasn't even in the house. So it was basically just me and the man that I had like hated for most of my life, like my stepdad, because I saw him as the transgressor again that brought all this anger and chaos into our house. It was just me and him in the house for like a month or so. And like conversations between us just always felt really forced. It was awkward. It was uncomfortable. I can tell he didn't necessarily particularly want to connect with me, or maybe he did, just didn't know how. So, but like it always felt like he was forcing it and like maybe just didn't even really want to. So it was really uncomfortable and I felt abandoned. I know my mom like it didn't really have as much to do with me. She was doing what she needed to do. But that's just unfortunately how it felt. I felt abandoned. I felt alone. I felt scared. I felt uncomfortable and awkward. And I was also going through a really personally transitional time with like starting a new school and getting into new activities and things like that, starting to drive and just being a teenager in general. And you're like, when you're 15 and 16 years old, a lot of stuff happens. So anyway, it was just a really confusing time. And so when I got off to college, I thought like, whew, this is my break from all that shit. I can finally go out and live my own life. I don't have anybody telling me what I need to be doing and yada yada. And unfortunately, back home during that time, there was a lot of shit back home that blew up. I mean, just can't even get into it way too much. That's for another story. But just shit was hitting the fan back home between my mom and my stepdad. And my mom was like calling me every day, it seems like crying, or every other day, like crying about some new thing that he did to like, create more chaos. And it was just like, I mean, he was kind of going off the deep end. He was getting back into drinking more heavily. I think he was dealing with a lot of stuff on his own and he just couldn't. So he resorted to heavy drinking and that was just making things even worse. And it got to the point where like it was a total dumpster fire back home. And I was still, even though I was like 3.5 hours away, I was still getting calls. Like I was still very much in it because of my mom. My mom kept calling me and my brother, telling us all this stuff that he was doing, like infidelity, and he was like running the business down into the ground and da-da-da-da. Like there was just a lot of big stuff happening. And this was still, as an adult, I was trying to establish my own life. This was still affecting me so much that I started going on my own volition, going to see a counselor at school. Like that was free student counseling. I started talking to someone a few times just to kind of like get it out because I had so much still. It was making me hate him all over again when I thought I had like left that stuff behind because I moved away. So I was having to relive all this stuff all over again, and it was just like really eating at me. It was just making me fester and like pissed off at him and just hating him because of all the antics he was doing, like whatever he was doing. And so at some point it seemed like things kind of calmed down again, and for some reason I decided that like I had a move to Texas planned basically, and I did it more so out of like helping myself really, but I moved back home for a few months so that I could work at the family business and like save, not have to pay rent and save money so that I could have money when I moved to Texas. And for the most part, it wasn't perfect, but it was manageable until my last day of work. Long story short, my stepdad and I, like he, again, was heavily drinking. He would leave work in the middle of the day to go to the bar for a few hours and just get hammered and would come back and just whatever. So I had to leave work early one day, and we got into this big fight, in which he basically called me a selfish bitch who only cared about myself, and I can go fuck myself. And that was it. That was it for me. I didn't have to deal with this stuff anymore. I was now an adult, and here I am, just can't get away from this dude and all the stuff that I was like in my mind. It was always him. He was the common denominator of all the chaos in the house, even though that wasn't entirely true. But that's just how I saw it at the time. And so I'm like, I'm not a child anymore. I can do something about this. So like the first thing I did was, well, he hung up on me. So the first thing I did was I called him back so that I could try to cuss him out back. And when he didn't answer the phone, I was just like livid. I just remember like my adrenaline was pumping, and I was just like furiously driving home because he just had called me and said these awful things to me and just made me feel like a piece of shit. And I get home, and he and my mom are on the phone. Like, I guess he called her to tell her what happened, and she was kind of defending me and whatever, so that pissed him off even more. So he ended up saying the same shit to my mom. You two are meant for each other. You're a bitch. Go fuck yourselves. Like that. And when I heard him on speakerphone saying this to her. So like, that was it for me. That was it. I was done. And I remember like, I was about to go be in my friend's wedding. It was her wedding rehearsal that I was having to go attend. And I'm sitting here I remember like being in the bathroom trying to apply makeup so that I can go be in this wedding rehearsal. And I'm sitting there like crying through my makeup as I'm trying to put it on. My mom's in there trying to like calm me down and stuff. And I just told her right then and there, I was like, you know what? I've had it. I've had it with him. I don't have to, like, I'm not talking to him ever again. He is now officially cut out of my life. And in that moment of anger, I decided that he was done. I was done with him. And so, that was my last conversation with him for years. And, fast forward, like, since that period of time, I had found myself in one relationship in particular that was with someone, like, not exactly like him, my stepdad, but, as far as, like, the anger and lashing out, was a lot like my stepdad. And that was very eye-opening to me to realize that I had chosen to be in a 2-year relationship with someone whose emotional management was a lot like my stepdad. Was fly off the handle, the like even hint of like any sort of disrespect or anything like that. And not only that, but there was 1 or 2 instances in particular where he lost his shit and got in my face screaming with his nose touching mine, spit flying on my face, and backed me up against the wall, just like my stepdad had done to me when I was a kid. And that was a very eye-opening moment for me, when I was literally in the same situation that I had been in with my stepdad, where there was this man in my face screaming at me, same style, like nose touching. And I was like, no, this is not happening. So, and it wasn't like in that moment even that I left with the relationship. I still stayed in it longer. But point being is that I had these realizations after the fact that, like, man, all this anger and resentment that I've been harboring my whole life up to this point has only done me harm. I'm not teaching him a lesson. Like, I'm not even talking to him. What lesson is he learning? As far as I knew, he didn't even like me anyway. So it's like, I wasn't teaching anybody a lesson. All I was doing was poisoning myself with anger and hatred and holding on to grudges. And somehow it was infiltrating my life through how I behaved in relationships and even like my choice in partners. So when I had that realization, I started understanding that I needed to learn how to let that go. And that in and of itself, that was a process that took several years. And part of what helped make it a little easier was that I realized that the best way for me to do that was through forgiveness. Because really all that forgiveness and healing is adopting a new and different perception and letting the old one go, because the old one's not serving you anymore, the old perception of what happened. And, healing is not free. Healing requires sacrifice. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Healing requires you to sacrifice your right to be angry, your right to hold grudges, and your right to judge someone else for being shittier than you think you are. So you have to be willing to look at yourself. Forgiveness is not about the other person at all. Everybody thinks it is. Everyone thinks it's like, oh, let's give him a free pass to be a shitbag, and I'm just going to look the other way and turn the other cheek. That's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is about looking at yourself and realizing that hanging on to shitty, negative emotions is poison for your soul, and it will find you. It will follow you into every relationship, every friendship, every familial relationship. It will manifest until you are willing to let it go. And that's what the cost is of healing, because it's counter to our human nature. But basically, I decided that I needed to forgive him somehow, and I didn't know how to do that until I started thinking like, well, why is he so angry in the first place? I started really trying to understand him. And in doing so, I learned through my mom about his family history, which also included a lot of emotional abuse, maybe even some physical abuse. I'm not sure. He was kicked out on the streets when he was 16. His, own mother was pretty controlling, and I just, that's his story, and it's not for me to tell. But basically, he had some shit growing up too that he was dealing with, and unfortunately never learned the emotional tools of how to manage and process that. And that doesn't excuse any of the behaviors. It just is what it is. It's just the truth. And I can either accept the truth for what it is, or I can say like, oh, that's not good enough. That's like, he doesn't deserve forgiveness. Again, forgiveness is not about someone's worthiness or deservingness to receive it. It's about you. You are doing yourself a disservice if you choose to hold on to anger and grudges. And I promise you that I lived through it. I know what it does when you do that. And I also am now on the other side of it, where I did let go of it, and I'm so much happier for it. I've gone through an amazing journey of self-discovery and self-healing that started with my willingness to do that. So I went through my own forgiveness process completely independent of anything. Like he didn't apologize to me or anything like that when I decided I was going to forgive him, and then I walked through that process. And then it wasn't until after I went through that process that one day he reached out to me completely unexpectedly and asked me for an opportunity to sit down and speak with him. He wanted to apologize to me and talk. And when I received that request, it just like everything I had been holding on to just bubbled up to the surface and just came spilling out of me. I just remember like sitting on my floor, like sobbing, because I realized that this shit still really affected me in a big way, and I thought I had let it go. I mean, I'd been walking through the process of forgiving. I just didn't have, I hadn't quite reached the process of closure yet. So I ended up sitting down with him and talking to him. And believe me when I say, my entire life, I had fantasized about an opportunity to just sit in there and tell him everything I ever thought about him, every nasty thought I ever had about him, making him feel like just as much of a piece of shit as he had made me feel my whole life, when he got in my face and yelled at me and told me I was bad and told me I was a little shit and a bitch and go fuck myself. Like, I wanted to make him feel all the shame and guilt and just, all that shit that he made me feel. And when it came down to it, when I finally had the opportunity, you know what happened? I had already worked through so much healing by that point and forgiveness that I was able to sit in a room with him, look him in the eye, and be sincere and authentic. And I didn't do that. I wasn't ugly to him. I was actually what I like to call professional, in that it's like I spoke my truth and I was sincere and I was authentic and I felt like he really needed to hear my perspective of like how his actions affected me. But I didn't do it with anger and malice. I did it in a way that was just honest. There was like no, I just sat and explained it to him very calmly. And in the end, he apologized for everything, for creating all of this chaos and for being shitty and for not being the father figure he would have liked to have been for me. And I accepted his apology. And he asked if we could, he said that he expressed that he would like to work on building or rebuilding a relationship. And honestly, my response to that was just like, for the first time in my life, I realized the importance of my boundaries. And I just said, you know what? I've already forgiven you. I really appreciate the apology and this opportunity. I know it took you a lot of guts to sit in front of me and face me like this. And I'm not saying this to be mean or spiteful, but I can't have a relationship with you because the one thing I've learned through all of my experiences with you is just that you're too high risk for me. I'm still too fragile right now to be strong enough to have a relationship with you or to work on one. So I appreciate it, but I can't. I'm sorry. And he was respectful of that. And that's pretty much where we left it off at that point. And there was something so, and I know that a lot of people don't get the opportunity, like don't get an apology, but I want to make it clear that his apology only came after I had already been working for years on my forgiveness and my healing process toward him. And I think that honestly, I see that opportunity as a blessing that was a reward, like the universe or God, whoever who you want to say, was rewarding me for the challenging and extremely painful and difficult work of looking to inside myself for healing rather than waiting for someone else to give it to me, which implies that I don't have control over my own healing and emotional processing. I do, and I owned that. I took responsibility for it and took myself through it. And in hindsight, I can be thankful for these experiences because I wouldn't be who I am today without those. And I love who I am now. I love the fact that I finally discovered my a purpose in helping other people walk through their own emotional processes and their own healing and letting go of their own shit, because we're in a time right now where everybody is just projecting their own fear and their own self-loathing and their own shit onto everybody else. And it's coming out in the form of like, oh, you're wrong and you need to fix this and you need to do that. Like, no, turn the finger inward and look at yourself. Clean up your own house before you're worried about going out cleaning up everybody else's yards. You know what I mean? So I'm, as challenging as that was, I understand now that we do not become powerful and self-empowered human beings without having to overcome challenges in our lives. And the bigger the challenges are for you to overcome, the more powerful you are in the aftermath when you learn how to overcome those things. And that's so, so important, that like to become the best version of yourself, to really enter your full power, to be successful even in business and careers. It starts with you turning the finger and your eyes inward and looking and examining at yourself and being willing to face the darkest and scariest parts of yourself that seem like impossible and overwhelming and that they're hurtful. And, like a lot of people just spend their whole lives they avoid the emotion. They avoid having to deal with this stuff because it's uncomfortable, because it makes us sad. But I'm telling you, I promise you, if you are willing to address these things you probably don't even know that you're carrying. You probably think, oh no, I'm over it. But trust me, if you haven't dealt with it, if you haven't processed it and forgiven it, I promise you, you're still carrying it around. I can promise you that. And I can speak that as someone who thought I was in the same boat, thinking I had dealt with my shit. Oh, I'm over it. I don't even talk to him anymore. Blah, 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 blah. But I somehow was able to still find ways and realize that it was, in fact, actually still affecting me in a big way. And I just was totally unaware of it. So anyway, that's my vulnerability post number 7. It's 28 minutes, so it's a lot longer than I was hoping to keep it. But, I was really sharing from my heart. And again, this is just my story from my perspective, what I dealt with and how I learned how to guide myself through a healing process. And now I'm helping people learn how to do it themselves. I understand what it's like to not really know where to start and what that looks like. But, I love being able to help other people do that now because it's so rewarding in the end after you get through it. And I've found so much self-empowerment and so much healing, so much creativity, and life is happening in a big way. I'm so excited for 2019. There's a lot of big things in the works, and I'm making this all happen, and I'm so excited about it that I finally found my power. So anyway, thanks again for listening. I hope this has been comforting and healing and empowering for somebody else who might have a similar circumstance or similar story. Just if you want to talk about it, please reach out to me. I'm happy to. This is I talk about this stuff all day long, joyfully. So just reach out to me. And thanks again for listening, guys. Hope you guys have a Merry Christmas and a really amazing New Year.